The agency is the principal governance body for nuclear energy globally, and it is the nucleus around which all the other parts of the nuclear governance system twirl, for the most part. So it's a very important organisation, and in addition it has found itself in all these international crises over the years. So the idea was devised by President Eisenhower in his famous Atoms for Peace speech in 1956, that you would have this agency that would assist countries with peaceful nuclear energy and, as I've said, not therefore lead them on to the bomb, the nuclear weapon. And the idea at the time was a rather naive one, that somehow if you provided countries with this nuclear technology, which was then thought to be very cheap and readily available, then somehow they would be distracted from getting the bomb. And no one had thought quite then how to safeguard this material and stop it getting to weapons hands. Originally the agency had a couple of roles which has since just let completely go. The original idea was the agency would acquire fissile material itself, that countries like the United States and the Soviet Union would give it nuclear material and it would then distribute it amongst those states requiring it. Subject to safeguards, of course, but that never happened. It turned out that the United States and the Soviet Union were willing to give this material directly to countries, so the agency really didn't have to play that middleman role. So that's one way in which it hasn't really fulfilled its function. And also it was not envisaged at that time that this agency would be so critical to international security. No one thought that this little technical body that was set up in Vienna all those years ago would become a key player in a case like the Iraq War, for instance, where the agency was called upon to say whether Iraq still had some nuclear weapons capability, and if it did, the United States was prepared to go to war to get rid of that capability. So suddenly you have this little technical organisation thrust into the international limelight. So that's one way in which it has definitely changed. And many people have now heard of it because they know about nuclear inspections, they know about inspections in North Korea and Iran. So the agency has actually over the years become much more important than we ever envisaged it would be. And it's also become politicised, because you can imagine these issues are very dear to member states' heart. There's security. So of course there are differing views about what the agency should do about certain things. Problems like Iran's non-compliance with its safeguards agreement, for instance. So that invariably injects politics into the situation. Well, these days it has quite a range of functions, some of which are in its statute. The statute is what was negotiated in setting the agency up by a group of countries. And that statute allows the agency to promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy, but also to conduct inspections and carry out other checks to ensure countries aren't acquiring nuclear weapons. But it also concerns itself with nuclear safety, so the possibility that nuclear reactors will explode or nuclear material will otherwise harm human beings or the environment. That's nuclear safety. It also has increasingly got into nuclear security, which is to prevent terrorists and other unauthorised people acquiring materials, stealing them or somehow purloining them in some other way, and then using them either in a nuclear weapon or a radiological weapon. People are very aware of it. It's very important to governments, and it needs to be part of the solution to issues like North Korea, Iraq, Iran, and therefore we need to make it as strong and as well functioning as we possibly can. The agency takes in nuclear safety a relatively modest role compared to nuclear safeguards, for instance, the non-proliferation side of things, but a supportive role. It's more in that mode that it has its role. And Fukushima really drew attention to the fact that the states hadn't given the agency enough authority or enough resources to assist in the case of an accident of the Fukushima type. So in some ways the agency was caught off guard by this. Many people had expectations that the agency would, for instance, provide a great deal of information about the incident, even generic information about what type of reactor was involved, what were the generic risks, but the agency didn't really feel it had the mandate to do that. It certainly wasn't very keen to do it immediately. It did over time. But there was a sense that that expectations of the agency exceeded its abilities. I think the Incident and Emergency Centre worked quite well. They got that into being straight away within 24 hours. But the question was then what resources were devoted to it. They had to scramble to bring staff into it to man the centre 24 hours while this long emergency was going on. The agency also wasn't able, it turns out, to say publicly what the scale of this accident was. There is a scale that is used internationally which is owned by the IAEA, but it turns out that the country that has the accident is the one that expresses the scale of the disaster, which seems rather strange because you expect that in that case the country would be downplaying how dangerous the disaster was. So you really need an independent body like the IAEA to be saying how big this disaster is. So that was another weakness that we discovered. And unfortunately Japan didn't trigger the Convention on Assistance in the case of an emergency. So the agency did have a relatively minor list of countries that would be able to offer assistance. And as soon as it notified all countries of the emergency, it had a lot of offerings of assistance, but Japan simply said we were not going to accept it. They were going to try and deal with the emergency themselves. And in some way that's understandable because it was very unexpected. It was a very large disaster, something that no one had anticipated. So you can imagine the Japanese themselves were quite stunned at what had happened, and in some ways were not in a position to say what assistance they required in the early days. And as time went on, you could less understand why they didn't seek assistance through the IAEA, but they actually didn't use that system at all. And paradoxically afterwards they criticised it. But the whole incident revealed that the agency itself doesn't have enough authority or enough resources to assist in this case. So that's something that needs to be attended to. Old facilities were a real part of the problem after Chernobyl. So all the Soviet-style reactors in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were closed down as a result of the Convention on Nuclear Safety, which had all states examine what the state of their reactors were, and these old ones were shut down almost straight away. Currently, states are allowed to maintain any type of reactor they like. They just have to make sure that it's safe. But safe, unfortunately, is not really defined very well, so it still remains for each state to examine its own safety procedures and the safety of its existing nuclear reactors. Fukushima, of course, is changing that. Now we're seeing states feeling an obligation to do these health checks, as it were, on each of their reactors, and some states are still in the process of doing that. But Japan, for instance, has looked at its nuclear reactors and decided not to reopen them immediately while it's conducting all these checks. So the situation is evolving in nuclear safety as it did after Chernobyl. Again, after Fukushima, we're seeing another round of insistence that all reactors are safe. But the older a reactor gets, the more likely the parts are to wear out and systems break down. They have, in many cases, been replaced over the years. They've been adding new parts, but still they don't have the same safety features as modern nuclear reactors will. So the new types of reactors, the generation 3, generation 4, are supposedly inherently more safer. They're being deliberately designed to be safer. For instance, they have safety systems which depend on gravity rather than on human intervention. And presumably that will make them safe. It's impossible to say how safe they'll be, but the assumption is that new technology will enable reactors to be safer. It has an action plan on nuclear safety which has been agreed by the member states, and the agency and the members are supposed to be putting this into place. And there are things in there like strengthening the peer review system for safety so that there are more reviews, they're more thorough, and they're done in cooperation with other organisations like the World Association of Nuclear Operators, WANO. They also conduct peer reviews. There are moves afoot to strengthen the recommendations on nuclear safety, so there's a speeded up process to review those. Unfortunately, they'll only be non-mandatory. Again, that's a problem in nuclear safety. Unlike nuclear safeguards, where there are mandatory requirements, again in nuclear safety there's nothing of that type. So unfortunately, we didn't use the window of opportunity presented by this disaster to create a very strong push towards better safety and a bigger role for the IAEA. The action plan is still evolving. It's still called a draft action plan because it's meant to evolve as we learn more about the accident and as we think more about what could be done to prevent and deal with an accident if it happens. But I'm not very confident there'll be major changes, because I think the emergency's passed. You really have to use this window very quickly to affect change within the IAEA. And it's done that effectively in the past, but in the case of Fukushima, I don't think it's going to do that. So again, I think we'll go back to a very slow evolution of stronger safety standards and a stronger agency role in all of this. Currently, states are allowed to maintain any type of reactor they like. They just have to make sure that it's safe. But safe, unfortunately, is not really defined very well, so it still remains for each state to examine its own safety procedures and the safety of its existing nuclear reactors. Fukushima, of course, is changing that. Now we're seeing states feeling an obligation to do these health checks, as it were, on each of their reactors, and some states are still in the process of doing that. But Japan, for instance, has looked at its nuclear reactors and decided not to reopen them immediately while it's conducting all these checks. So the situation is evolving in nuclear safety as it did after Chernobyl. Again, after Fukushima, we're seeing another round of insistence that all reactors are safe. But the older a reactor gets, the more likely the parts are to wear out, its systems break down. They have, in many cases, been replaced over the years. They've been adding new parts, but still they don't have the same safety features as modern nuclear reactors will. So the new types of reactors, the generation 3, generation 4, are supposedly inherently more safer. They're being deliberately designed to be safer. 9/11 was an unusual case in that it, of course, was a non-nuclear incident, and yet it, like Fukushima and Chernobyl and Iraq, did have an effect on the agency, and the thinking was that this could have been a nuclear incident. Had the terrorists been able to acquire radioactive material, had they been able to construct a small nuclear weapon, they might have chosen those methods instead of flying aircraft into the Twin Towers. So it actually sparked a lot of creative thinking about what terrorists might be doing in terms of the nuclear issue and whether nuclear terrorism was a real threat or not. And many experts, including those here at the Belfer Centre at Harvard, have concluded that it is a very real threat. So there was pressure on the agency to do something about this nuclear security threat. And the idea here is to prevent unauthorised access to nuclear materials that may be in production plants or reactors or in transport, in transit, to prevent them either making a crude nuclear device or a radiological weapon or a radioactive dispersal device, an RDD, which would simply spread radioactivity around a city for the purpose of terror. And the agency has a role in this because, again, it can put forward recommendations to states on strengthening their security, their nuclear security. It can assist them. It can conduct peer reviews, again, as in the case of safety. It can help states with a comprehensive plan for their nuclear security. Some states don't have any nuclear security plan at all, particularly the smaller developing countries. They've never seen a need for this. But you can imagine that in terms of smuggling nuclear material, you only need a couple of countries who are the weakest link, and that becomes a global threat. So the push really was for the agency to help states, member states, with their nuclear security and thus tighten nuclear security globally. So that's been the push. Unfortunately, like nuclear security, there's nothing mandatory about this for states. So everything the agency can do is voluntary. We do have a couple of nuclear security conventions, the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, and the agency helps implement that. There is an amendment to that treaty which has not yet come into force, despite 9/11. So again, it is a rather slow-moving picture. The agency have been given various additional responsibilities and roles, but it's nothing like nuclear safeguards. It's not compulsory, it's not mandatory, there are no penalties, there's no monitoring, no verification as there is in the safeguards area. So as in the case of nuclear safety, nuclear security is, in a sense, not quite as robust as the non-proliferation area, and not subject to the same checks and verification and attention as nuclear proliferation. It's becoming increasingly important in the agency's agenda. There is something of a problem in that nuclear security is not mentioned in the IAEA statute, the governing statute of the agency. And some developing countries are saying, well, this is not really the agency's business. This should be done elsewhere. We've had a series of nuclear summits. The current one in Seoul has just ended. The first one was in Washington, and there was one in Seoul, and there's one to be in the Netherlands in a couple of years. So that, in a way, has taken the attention away from the IAEA, even though the summits will mention the agency in their communiques and will encourage it to do good work. In a sense, the agency is sharing authority and attention on this issue with these summits. So the agency really has to struggle to make its mark in this field, and my hope is over the years that it will. It's getting more money to do this, it's more attention. But fundamentally, I think states have to change their attitude towards nuclear security and not regard it as so secretive that they can't cooperate on the issue, and not so secretive that they can't share lessons learned with the agency, and be confident enough to accept peer reviews and criticism, as is in the case of other areas. We need the agency because the agency is the only multilateral body in this field. It has the credibility and the legitimacy that other bodies won't. The nuclear summits, for instance, even though they bring together heads of state in many cases and senior officials, it's not a UN organisation, it's not multilateral in the true sense. It's a hand-picked group of countries that have come together, usually hand-picked by the United States. They've been invited by the US or the host. It is not truly multilateral. And for many states, many developing countries, they will look to a UN-type body, a truly multilateral one, to give them advice and assistance. Otherwise, they feel like it's always the rich developed countries telling them what to do. So a multilateral organisation like the IAEA is perfect in dissipating those fears and creating the possibility for assistance to be received without strings attached. And it's done on an independent, unbiased basis. So that's why we need the agency to be involved in nuclear security, particularly because many states are suspicious about the nuclear security issue anyway. They think it's about Western states trying to control them and interfering in their sovereignty. So the agency is a good go-between between those who want to provide assistance and provide funding and those who really need to receive it. Well, nuclear safeguards are a series of checks to ensure that countries aren't diverting their nuclear material. And they do this through inspections. That's the most renowned way they do it. They also do it through materials accounting. So countries have to declare what materials they have, what facilities they have, and then the nuclear accountants go in and make sure that makes sense, that measures up. But increasingly, the agency is also being much more proactive in using intelligence information from other states, particularly the United States, but also France, UK, Israel, other countries. It gathers open source information that is in the open literature, in newspapers, magazines, government reports. There's amazing amounts of that material there. So the agency is taking a much more holistic approach to each state to determine whether it's complying with its agreement not to acquire nuclear weapons. So the agency's moved away from this accountancy idea, ticking boxes in a form to ensure materials not diverted, to a much more activist, if you like, look at what states are doing. And it's all designed to stop them producing nuclear weapons. So that's a major contribution of the agency to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons to states which don't already have them. The agency didn't invent nuclear safeguards. In fact, that was the United States. The United States has a series of bilateral agreements with other countries in which it attempted to impose conditions for the sale of uranium, for instance, or research reactors. And it would say to the other country, well, we'll sell you this material or this equipment, but you have to report to us what you're doing with them. You can't sell them onto other countries. You have to permit our officials to look at what you're doing. So the agency took that model and then grew it. So essentially the IAEA now is the organisation globally that does these inspections for nuclear proliferation, non-proliferation purposes. There's a European agency called Euratom which also does them, but on a lesser scale, and they've also handed them over to the agency. There's a bilateral Argentinian-Brazilian agency which does bilateral inspections, and many countries like Canada and Australia which sell uranium also have bilateral agreements with their customers. But it's the IAEA which really runs the international safeguard system. So they're at the hub of this safeguards network, and it's they who declare whether a state is in compliance or not compliance with its safeguards agreement. So they don't just carry out the inspections, they reach a conclusion and then they will make a recommendation if they find a state in non-compliance. And there have been several cases of that. New facilities can be difficult to apply safeguards to, particularly the new models we're seeing of nuclear power reactors, so generation 3 and generation 4 power reactors. We really haven't worked out what the safeguard system will be for those. So the agency is trying to devise a means of safeguards by design, so that when the plants are designed from the ground up, they can have safeguards in mind. Safeguards may, for instance, require cameras to be installed. You don't really want to be putting cables in for cameras after the building's already been built, particularly a sensitive site like a nuclear reactor. So it's better to do this from the outside, the outset. In the old reactors, we had no choice. They weren't designed for safeguards and we just had to make do. In the new facilities, there should be a way of having them pre-prepared for nuclear safeguards. So that, in some ways, we're in better shape with the new facilities. With the old facility, we know really how they run, and we're pretty confident we can apply safeguards to them. There is a problem though with facilities neither new nor old, but they're bulk handling facilities. So conversion facilities where you're converting uranium into a form usable in a nuclear reactor, enrichment facilities where you're enriching the uranium, plutonium reprocessing plants. All those they have a lot of bulk material going in and out. It gets stuck in the pipes. It's often difficult to make an accounting judgment on where material has been and gone. The agency still doesn't have a good handle on that problem. They're working at it, in particular with Japan, which has a lot of plutonium reprocessing activity. But again, that's a challenge. And if we see increases in these activities in states which don't have nuclear weapons already, then that's quite a challenge for safeguards to handle. Non-compliance is a huge issue because it's only, unfortunately, been through non-compliance episodes like Iraq, Iran, that we have improved the safeguard system. It's provided the political impetus for change in the safeguard system, and unfortunately it has in some senses called the safeguard system into disrepute. Prior to the discovery that Iraq almost had developed nuclear weapons secretly, there was an assumption that safeguards were working quite well. There hadn't really been major incidents, a few minor ones. So I guess there was something of a lethargy apparent in the international community about safeguards. And originally they weren't designed to be 100% effective. They were really meant to be checking up on a gentleman's agreement in some respects. We all knew that the safeguard system wasn't 100% foolproof, but we were hoping that states would abide by their legally binding obligations not to acquire nuclear weapons. Well, it turned out that that was probably somewhat naive. And there were states who were willing to cheat, and so we've had Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Syria as the major non-compliance cases. But fortunately all of those have led to attempts to reconfigure the safeguard system, rethink the way reports are done on non-compliance, to try and hone the system so that this won't happen again, and so that non-compliance cases will be handled better than they have in the past. Quite difficult to do a comparison of the IAEA with other organisations in terms of effectiveness or efficiency. My own study looked primarily at the agency. There were a couple of comparative areas with other organisations, but the IAEA is unique. That's a laboured word, but there's no other body that deals with nuclear governance in the international system in the way the agency does. So it's really difficult to compare it with a body like UNESCO, for instance, which deals with social and educational issues, with the World Food Programme, which deals with food. Obviously requires a lot of funding for food projects and providing food to developing countries. It's hard to find an organisation that is quite in the same category as the IAEA. The International Civil Aviation Organisation is one that I did look at, but more in terms of the authorities it gives to its governing boards rather than effective and efficient management. The agency has a good reputation. Most people you talk to say it's reasonably efficient and effective compared to other UN-type organisations, but it's really quite difficult to measure precisely. There have been various studies over the years by outside observers of the agency, and by and large they say it is good value for money and is relatively efficient and effective. But between the lines you can see difficulties, as in all organisations, whether international or corporate or national. No organisation is perfect. So I think on the whole it's well governed. I think it certainly represents value for money given its incredibly important role in international security. But to be very precise is quite difficult. And one of the recommendations of the CIGI report is that an independent management study be done of the agency. There hasn't been such a thing for now a decade, and it's high time it was done. And it needs to be independent, it needs to be comprehensive, it needs to look at all of the facets of the agency management in a way that my own report could not do. You need specialists in management essentially to look at the agency and to make brave recommendations. So this has to be truly a standoff inquiry, not part of the agency's own internal processes. The major successes of the agency, I think, over the years has been in responding to these crises, these international crises, improving its ability to detect diversion of nuclear materials to weapons purposes, in assisting many states with their peaceful nuclear activities. It's got a technical cooperation program which over the years has provided things like X-ray machines and assistance with agriculture and health using radioactive techniques, of course. It has also, over the years, gradually acquired quite authority in terms of safety standards and now security standards. So when new countries are thinking of getting into the peaceful nuclear field, they look naturally to the agency. It's the agency which has these standards, the only international body which does. And the agency will provide help with states in thinking about a nuclear energy program, whether they should get into it or not. It has a great milestones document which lays out all the tasks that a state should accomplish before it even has its first nuclear reactor. So I think on all those grounds the agency has done extremely well. Where it hasn't done so well is on things that really it wasn't ever intended to or wasn't equipped to, but where we've all come to expect it to be more proficient. So again, you have this problem about high expectations and low provision of funding and facilities. And examples would be, for instance, in being able to detect undeclared facilities and materials, in not being as well prepared as it might be for future developments of nuclear technology, in having a safeguards culture. These are the inspectors I'm talking about now, where a mentality of accounting came into being, where inspectors were no longer curious or were not looking beyond the information they were given. They were simply going in and ticking boxes, is the metaphor used. So over time, international organisations or any organisations tends to become rather self-satisfied with its job, and I think there are certain periods in the agency's history when that has certainly happened. But as I say, it has responded pretty well to crises when these have occurred, which is heartening. Not every organisation can do that. Some simply fade away or collapse. But the agency has managed over the years to respond to this, so that is a good thing. But I also think it's important to be clear about where responsibility lies in this. The agency can only be as good as its member states allow it to be, and in some ways the members are the ones who've been misbehaving on this score. There's much more politicisation in the governing bodies of the agency, the General Conference and the Board of Governors particularly. The case of Iran has really stretched relationship between member states. The United States and Iran are at loggerheads, obviously, over the nuclear weapon issue, and that plays itself out in the agency's own forums, which is not a good thing. Under the Bush administration, there was a lot of pressure on the Director General to do exactly what the United States wanted him to do. That's Mohammed al-Baradei. So relationships really didn't go very well during his tenure. There's a new Director General, of course, so it is hoped that this will be a new era. But member states have to be aware that the agency will need strengthening and reform. It doesn't perform at its optimum level right now, and unless they give those resources to the agency, it's not going to be able to meet the expectations. And Fukushima was an example of very high expectations for the agency that weren't met. People would call Vienna and ask the agency, reporters or members of the general public, what's going on, what should we do, should we evacuate people from Tokyo, what's your response? And often the agency was non-committal. So there was an expectation that the agency is this global governance body, the hub of nuclear security or nuclear safety or non-proliferation, and it not only has to act like that, it has to be able to fulfill these expectations and these promises. So it's the member states ultimately who are responsible for this. The agency, like any organisation, has things within its own powers it could do to strengthen and reform itself, and a lot of that has to do with the way it manages itself internally. So, for instance, it doesn't have the proper systems in place for recruiting, overseeing, counselling, providing career guidance for its staff members, career planning. It doesn't do a very good job of assessing staff performance. All those things could be put in place by the agency itself. It doesn't need its member states to tell it to do that. It could be more transparent in what it does. It has a culture of secrecy, which probably comes from safeguards and the sensitivity of that. And it also stems now from nuclear security, which is also a highly sensitive area. But the agency cannot garner increasing support from the general public or civil society or anyone unless it's more revealing about what it's doing and what its challenges are. So it needs to sell itself better. It needs a better public relations profile, better public diplomacy. Its website, for instance, is fine at the premier and secondary levels, but below that, for a researcher, it's a nightmare. So if you've got researchers who are looking at the agency, hoping to do a flattering report on it, and then you can't access documents or critical information, then that is a problem for the agency's image. There's a famous story about Mohammed al-Baradei, the Director General, asking various departments in the agency for the number of research reactors, and each department came up with a different number. And I think it dawned on him then, well, the agency itself wasn't doing a very good job in terms of internal transparency and internal cooperativeness, and much less external public relations. So the agency has a transparency problem, it has an internal stovepiping problem. Each of the departments of the agency tend to operate like little separate departments and not cooperate across the board. And that's something for agency management itself. Member states don't have to have anything to do with that. The agency can do that internally. So there are quite a few things the agency could do relatively quickly to bring its performance to a higher level. Longer term, one of the challenges is that it might be asked to do tasks which currently are beyond it. And I'm thinking in terms of nuclear disarmament, for instance. The agency could very well be invited to verify a fissile material cut-off treaty. That is a ban on the use of or the creation of fissile material for weapons purposes. So there'd be a global ban on this, and the IAEA is the obvious body to verify compliance with this treaty. It hasn't convinced enough countries yet that it is the body to do this, so it needs to work on that. It also needs to start considering what happens when it is asked by the Russians or the United States to verify excess stocks from weapons destruction. So as the United States and Russia lower their nuclear arsenals, the idea is that they would bring in the IAEA to help verify that this material had been taken from weapons and would be disposed of and would no longer be available for military purposes. So that's a role the agency has been contemplating. It's been negotiating with the Russians and the US about how this would be done, but there is still not total confidence that this would be achievable. And the main issue here is that in doing this verification work, the agency should not have access to any weapons-related information. You don't want a proliferation initiative or non-proliferation initiative like this leading to proliferation. That is, that the agency itself becomes aware of how to build a nuclear weapon. That's the last thing you want. So these things have to be worked on before the agency will be given the role of verification in these cases. The agency also faces a challenge in monitoring new types of nuclear reactors that come along the pipeline, and some of these are still on the drawing board. We don't even know what they'll look like, but there are successive generations of nuclear power plants that are coming forward. The agency needs to do a lot of work on those as to whether these plants are safe and secure and they can be easily subject to nuclear safeguards. So the idea is that it works with designers to ensure that there's inbuilt safety and security and inbuilt availability to nuclear safeguards. These are big challenges. And in the future also it needs to continually pay attention to the idea that there might be states out there with illicit activities not declared that the agency doesn't know about. This is a relentless, endless problem, because as the typical verification problem is, we don't know what we don't know. It's all very well for states to declare what they have and to trust that declaration and monitor that, but if states don't declare everything they have, or after they've declared they start building new secret facilities, then that's a problem for the agency. So it always has to keep its eyes and ears open for the possibility of another non-compliance case like Iran coming up, and it needs to hone its techniques to be able to do that. That's just an endless challenge, because if you think about it, the agency has to be there forever. If we're serious about getting rid of nuclear weapons ultimately and winding them down in the meantime and preventing new states acquiring nuclear weapons, then this is an endless job that's perpetual. So the agency has to have a vision of itself as going forever, basically, and getting better and better. One reason why it needs a strategic plan. It doesn't have a strategic plan. It needs that vision, that constant risk assessment about the wider world to ensure that disaster doesn't befall. The world is safer for having the IAEA, definitely. It's not safe enough, and as I've indicated, the agency does have quite a ways to go to strengthening and reform, and in some ways it's an endless task. It has to always be ahead of those who would misuse nuclear materials for weapons purposes or other destructive purposes. So it's an endless task, and member states, who are ultimately responsible for this, need to provide the agency with the means to make the world safer and safer. So yes, the world is safer because of the agency. It could be safer still, and we need to provide the agency with the means to do that.
The atomic age has moved forward at such a pace that every citizen of the world should have some comprehension, at least in comparative terms, of the extent of this development, of the utmost significance to every one of us.
Well, what Eisenhower was doing was reframing the nuclear debate and shifting it from fear of nuclear weapons to the promise of the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And he was essentially offering to the world that the United States and other countries with nuclear technology would help countries around the world take advantage of the peaceful atom. Now, some people raised the concern even back then, wait a minute, is there really that much difference between the peaceful atom and the atom for war? The head of Israel's nuclear program at one point said there aren't really two atoms. There's one atom that you can use for both things. And that was really the origin of the International Atomic Energy Agency, was the notion we'll export these peaceful nuclear technologies, but we'll have inspections of them to make sure they're only used for peaceful purposes. I think Atoms for Peace had both positive and negative aspects with respect to nuclear proliferation. Certainly the spread of nuclear technology, even ostensibly civilian technology, contributed to nuclear weapons programs in a number of countries. And I think actually that, as a colleague of mine at MIT has put it, it wasn't so much spreading highly enriched uranium around that was the problem. It was spreading little atomic energy commissions around that was the problem. These institutions became sort of the bureaucratic base for nuclear weapons programs in some countries. And also the technology spread did contribute in cases like India's nuclear program, just as an example. But I think there was also a positive aspect in that by focusing countries on the civilian side of the atom and by building up an international nuclear watchdog in the form of the International Atomic Energy Agency, it helped lay the groundwork for what later became the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which had as its basic pillars the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, limits on the spread of weapons to additional countries, and nuclear disarmament by the states that already had nuclear weapons. Well, one part of the idea at the beginning was that the International Atomic Energy Agency would have a big stock of nuclear material that it could provide to countries that would come from the weapon stocks of the United States and the Soviet Union, and that never really happened. So there's still a part of the IAEA statute that's sort of about the IAEA as a bank for nuclear material, and that's never really happened. There's a pale shadow of it that is coming into play now with the notion of an IAEA-controlled fuel bank, which is just coming from normal low-enriched uranium rather than being drawn from the weapon stocks or what have you. And the idea of the fuel bank is that if a country decided to rely on international supply for its nuclear fuel, and if that country then at some point had a problem, some supplier that it was relying on cut it off or something like that, then it would be able to come to the IAEA and say, please help, and the IAEA would have this stock of fuel that it could then provide to a country. So it gives a country more confidence that it can rely on the international market for nuclear fuel and not have to make its own.
So the NPT, or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is the world's pillar of the non-proliferation effort, with the treaty signed, negotiated in 1968 and signed and ratified over the following 2 years. At the moment it has 189 member countries, which is only 4 short of the total United Nations membership total. Only 4 countries that aren't members right now: Israel, Pakistan, India, and North Korea. The NPT was established basically to accomplish 3 things simultaneously. The first one was promote disarmament among the existing nuclear powers of the time. Secondly, discourage and slow the rate of nuclear proliferation to countries that didn't yet have nuclear weapons. And third, promote the peaceful use of nuclear technology, primarily for electricity generation. And it does the 3 of these in coordinated fashion. It's been very successful in 2 of the 3, less successful in 1 of the 3. And of course, the one it's not been very successful on so far is disarmament. While the countries that had nuclear weapons in 1968 have, generally speaking, fewer than they did at the time, they're still, all of them, quite a long way away from full disarmament, and that is the ultimate goal of that particular pillar of the NPT.
It's a treaty, but it's a political bargain. And it's a political bargain between the nuclear haves and have-nots. The nuclear halves, the nuclear weapon states, agree not to support or to promote the proliferation of weapons and weapons technology, not to threaten to use it. And then the non-nuclear weapon states agree not to try to obtain nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons technologies.
The NPT does two things. It establishes a set of procedures and mechanisms to enable the world to know that nuclear weapons technology is not getting out of hand, that it's not spreading willy-nilly, that we won't be surprised by countries all of a sudden developing nuclear weapons when we didn't expect that they even had programs in place. So it gives just an early warning, it provides ways of slowing and discouraging countries from acquiring, and it gives us a way of knowing the state of the world in terms of who's doing what and why. It also does a second thing, which is it promotes the norm of non-proliferation. Nuclear weapons are something that the world as a whole increasingly abhors. There's a strong, growing public aversion to the idea that international security should rely anywhere on the possession of nuclear weapons. And of course, there's a global abhorrence of the idea of nuclear war. Contrary to popular belief, this is not yet at the level of a taboo. A taboo is such a strict social prohibition that the actual thought of something generates a feeling of disgust. That's not yet true with nuclear weapons, because many countries in fact have strategic policies that at least officially require the use of nuclear weapons under certain circumstances. But there is a growing norm against the reliance on nuclear weapons, and the NPT is one of the main vehicles through which that norm is promoted.
The IAEA has become, in some senses, the watchdog of the NPT, as it is the watchdog of other nuclear agreements, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty or the Partial Test Ban Treaty and others. So the IAEA is responsible for investigating, for monitoring, for protecting safeguards, making sure that nuclear power plants are safe, for security, for making sure that post 9/11 terrorist threats are managed, and also for the promotion of the third part of the bargain, the promotion of technologies and new capabilities for the peaceful use of nuclear energy for the non-nuclear weapon states.
In order to benefit from the pro-civilian nuclear power generation pillar of the NPT, signatories must also accept safeguards and inspections. And it's the IAEA that performs those vital functions. They're the folks, generally speaking, who are on the front lines keeping track of who's doing what nuclear materials are where, what kinds of programs different countries have, and how safe nuclear materials are being safeguarded.
It has failed if we say India, Pakistan, North Korea, allegations now, investigations about Iran, Syria, Iraq. We could say that the NPT treaty didn't deal with those.
Now, whether or not the NPT unraveled because of the Indian test is an arguable point, because the countries who became the real proliferators or the difficult ones or the problematic ones were Iraq, which had signed the NPT and then violated its obligations, but the Iraqi question was settled by the Israelis unilaterally, not by the IAEA. The IAEA kept having inspections and kept calling the evidence inconclusive, which is part of the IAEA. They keep going and they keep coming back with inconclusive reports. And so that became part of the problem. But the Israelis lost patience and they went ahead and bombed the Osiriq reactor. And the same thing the Israelis were to do with the Syrian facility a few years later. And then the case of North Korea, another NPT signatory, in violation of its international obligation, and now the current case of Iran. So we have an interesting situation here where three countries which were signatories to the NPT were in violation, and the Indian government, which had refused to accept the NPT quite openly and vigorously, was seen as the problem. But few years later, and this is post-1998. Now, the US government, recently the State Department came out with a statement saying India has an impeccable non-proliferation record, which is a far cry from what was being said by the Canadian government in 1974.
We don't know how well it's worked until it doesn't work, but it may be that the fact that only a few countries have sought nuclear weapons and have been able to obtain it means that the NPT has done a fairly good job.
So you see how things quickly change and how the whole issue of non-proliferation has to be reframed, and the role of the IAEA has to be reframed in terms of who is the real problem and what is the nature of the problem and what is the solution.
At the time the NPT was first negotiated, the expectation was that within 20 or 30 years there would probably be at least 20 or 30 countries who would acquire nuclear weapons in the meantime. That hasn't happened. The actual rate of nuclear proliferation has been very, very slow, pleasantly surprisingly slow. But on top of that, it's almost certainly the case that the NPT has slowed the rate of proliferation, both by discouraging it through promoting the norm of non-proliferation and by making it more difficult for countries who want nuclear weapons to get them. Because the NPT, through the mechanism of the IAEA and the various safeguards and nuclear suppliers group, has made it harder for the countries who might want to develop nuclear weapons to acquire the expertise, the machines and materials they would need, and in particular the fissile materials that are necessary for a nuclear explosion.
India tested in 1974. This was Mrs. Gandhi's decision. It was a highly secret decision, but it had been preceded by a long debate and public announcements. From 1948, the Indian Prime Minister Nehru, her father, had said that India preferred peaceful uses of atomic energy, but had the right to use it for defense purposes if needed. This was quite well known to the world community. It was known to the government of Canada, because Canada and India negotiated the supply of the Cyrus reactor, which was used for the 74 test. So there was a long history of contact between Canada and India, USA and India, the French and the Russians, the French in particular, on cooperating with India's atomic energy development.
The Indian test was significant largely when it didn't happen. In other words, that it didn't happen before 1968, because the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty legitimizes nuclear possession by any state that had tested before the signature of the treaty. India was almost ready to test, but not quite, and it tested 4 years after the NPT, which has put it outside the nuclear non-proliferation regime ever since, despite the fact that its nearest competitor, China, was included within the legitimate holders of nuclear weapons by virtue of its having tested a couple of years earlier.
There was a widespread condemnation by the world community of the Indian test. But Mrs. Gandhi, after the test, had said, this is a scientific experiment, we are not going to develop nuclear weapons. And this is what happened from 1974 to 1998, when the Prime Minister Bajpai, he ordered 5 tests, and he immediately declared that India is now a nuclear weapon state. So there was a difference between what was said by the Indian government in 74 and what was said by them in 1998. But the reaction of the world community also differed. In the 70s, after the 74 test, strong condemnation, strong pressure for India to get into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, strong resistance by the Indian government saying no, it is discriminatory and we are not going to go near the treaty. But the pressure was there. 1998, after India declared that it was a nuclear weapon state, there was condemnation initially, but it lasted only about 6 months. And then immediately thereafter, the United States government and European governments, they started strategic dialogues with India.
The Indian explosion didn't have that much impact on the IAEA safeguards for a very simple reason that most of the Indian facilities were not under IAEA safeguards. And this was only to do with the Cyrus reactor and perhaps the plutonium produced there, but again, this was not subject to the IAEA safeguards. So from the safeguards point of view, very little. Non-proliferation point of view and export control point of view, a lot.
The Indian test had a big effect in international thinking because India had been seen as the 6th nuclear proliferator. And the theory was, it was a theory, although technically Israel was the 6th, but since they never made a declaration, right, that didn't count. India was seen as sort of the tripwire, as the 6th, which would trigger a domino effect, not only Pakistan but others. That was a theory propagated by the director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Alistair Buchan, who was a good friend of the Americans. And so the two of them were pushing this view that India was key in the non-proliferation effort. And so the advocates of the NPT had a great interest in keeping India in check.
There are really two phases to India's involvement in nuclear non-proliferation. From the time that it tested in the 1970s, when it claimed it was a peaceful nuclear explosive, to its decision in the 1990s to openly test a nuclear weapon. Through the period between those two tests, India was reasonably constructive on nuclear non-proliferation issues, in part because it never got involved, as Pakistan we now know did, in spreading nuclear weapons beyond itself, but also because it insisted throughout the period that any non-proliferation had to take place in the context of disarmament. In other words, it was more than willing, it said, to give up any potential it had for developing nuclear weapons, as long as those who had actually already developed the weapons would give them up as well. It tested in the late 1990s, not long after the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was permanently extended, making it unlikely, in the Indians' view, that the 5 legitimate nuclear weapon states were going to live up to their commitments to disarm.
The Chernobyl nuclear accident took place on April the 26th, 1986, which is now more than 26 years ago. And it was a result of an experiment of sorts, a test which was being done on the reactor at Chernobyl, or one of the reactors at Chernobyl, an experiment which went wrong. And it was to test, in fact, how best to deal with an emergency. It was a test which was aimed at, finding out how to deal with an emergency, but the test itself caused the emergency, which led to an explosion, which led to what is now called the Chernobyl nuclear disaster.
There was widespread concern about the general safety of nuclear power plants. There had been, throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, a number of significant nuclear accidents in the UK and in the United States and through Europe. But obviously this one was the biggest catastrophe and the highest level catastrophe that had taken place, that had a global impact as well as a regional impact. So I think it brought attention to problems. It brought more attention to concerns about the safety of Russian or Soviet power plants at that time.
And in terms of the immediate impact on the population, well, of course, you had quite a few people living next to or close to the reactor, people who were involved in servicing the reactor and the electrical power plant and so on and so forth associated with the reactor. One day after the accident actually took place, after the disaster, most of the population from the immediate area was evacuated. The other short-term impact was on the individuals, a very large number of individuals who initially or soon after the disaster were involved in the cleanup operations. And there are estimates I've seen of close to 500,000 people who in one way or another were involved either soon after the accident or in the years after the accident in various phases of the cleanup.
The Chernobyl reactor was a type that was reasonably common throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and they were all shut down as a result of Chernobyl and the Convention on Nuclear Safety. The Convention on Nuclear Safety said you had to make checks on your existing reactor fleet, and if they were unsafe you had to close them down. Well, the Eastern Europeans did that almost straight away.
The IAEA needs governments to declare what is going on, to allow it in, to let it respond. The response of the Soviet government was to hide and deny. It did not have the capacity to respond as well as we might have hoped it to. It's done a lot to expand its abilities, but at that time I think it was overwhelmed and also under-supported.
The decision to make a large-scale public announcement that has informed the Soviet public as a whole about the accident was taken only 2 days after the accident and after a radioactive cloud floated over Sweden, and the high levels of radioactivity were noticed by the Swedes, who immediately pressed the panic button, what is going on? In a sense, the Soviet Union was forced to admit to what was going on, but only after there was outside international reaction, a reaction on the part of Sweden and eventually other countries as well.
After Chernobyl, we realized that nuclear safety really wasn't all it should be. So the international community got together and they negotiated several new agreements, all of which gave the IAEA some role in their implementation. So we have the Convention on Nuclear Safety, which provides for countries to report periodically to review meetings on their improvements in nuclear safety. And then recommendations are made to each country to improve. So this is a good example of peer review and how effective that can be. Then there are a couple of international treaties about accidents. Chernobyl was obviously the worst accident we'd had to that point. So the agency is given a role in arranging with states in advance what they might contribute to help in the case of a nuclear accident. That's the Accident Assistance Convention. And then we have an Emergency Notification Convention as well, whereby states are supposed to notify the IAEA as soon as there's some accident or incident or disaster, and the agency will then seek assistance for the state in distress and do all sorts of other things like issue commentary on how bad the accident is, make recommendations about what states should do about the consequences of the accident. So Chernobyl led to these improvements, and the agency itself set up an emergency and incident centre which would spring into life once an accident happened. It arranged for states to be improving their own emergency preparedness and response capabilities. So in general, trying to make an accident less likely, and if one happened, to make the situation better.
Well, Iraq had been a member in good standing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It had a full-scope IAEA safeguards, and the IAEA had never raised a serious issue. And then all of a sudden we find that in fact they have this huge nuclear weapons program underway. So it really sent a message that the old approach of inspectors going to the places that the state tells them about and looking at the things that the state says they should look at, and not thinking about what may be going on someplace else that the state doesn't want them to know about, isn't really going to work anymore. We need to focus on the state as a whole.
So the realization that they had had a secret, dedicated weapons program that remained undetected and to some extent unsuspected called into question the efficacy of the safeguards system, and those critics who doubted that the system was sufficient had a lot of grist for their mill.
And they were found also on sites that IAEA inspectors had visited before on a non-intrusive basis. Then it was a significant shock. It was a significant blow to the credibility of the existing, if you want, regime of safeguards.
The system is designed to give states the confidence to remain without nuclear weapons because they know their neighbors aren't getting nuclear weapons either. And what that said was, maybe the system as it exists right now isn't really good enough to give us that confidence that our neighbors aren't getting nuclear weapons. And so states sort of joined together and said, let's build a stronger system. Let's build a system that gives the IAEA access to more information, access to more places, easier ways for its inspectors to get in and out of countries in a hurry, and a variety of other tools that allow the system to be more effective.
I think that the obvious conclusion to come out of the Iraq experience of 1991 and aftermath was that the existing system was inadequate, and so there was an effort undertaken to strengthen the safeguard system, particularly by augmenting the IAEA's powers of inspections and rights to information. And out of this reform process came something known as the Additional Protocol, which essentially was a model agreement, voluntary to member states, that in fact conferred on the IAEA additional rights of inspection and additional rights to information. And so the hope was that this would be sufficient to prevent future Iraq-like surprises.
The changes in the IAEA safeguard system weren't immediate. And it is important to understand that what the IAEA was able to do in Iraq after 1991 is something they will probably never be able to do in most other countries, because Iraq was a defeated state and the UN Security Council imposed an inspection regime on Iraq that states in general aren't going to just voluntarily offer into. Iraq was subject to anytime, anywhere inspections with almost unlimited resources for the inspectors because it was being funded out of Iraq's oil revenue, again, legally imposed on it by the Security Council when Iraq had been militarily defeated. That's not a situation that's going to exist in other states. Neither the resources that were available to the IAEA nor the authority that was available to the IAEA are going to exist in other countries in general. But it took a period of years after the Iraq episode to really negotiate out the new additional protocol system. And then even once the additional protocol had been negotiated, then one by one states had to accept it. And then even when states had accepted it and the IAEA had begun carrying out the new kinds of inspections and information exchanges with states under the additional protocol, it then took a period of years to really sort of build the full potential and build a new system. In fact, I would say it's still a work in progress, really shifting to a state-centered approach rather than a sort of facilities and criteria. We're going to do this many inspections because there's this much plutonium at this facility, rather than we're going to do this many inspections because our overall knowledge of what's going on in the state suggests there's this level of concern and this number of questions that need to be answered about the state's activities. That's really a big conceptual shift in how safeguards are done.
It has been effective in the sense that those countries' denial of the IAEA's inspections is a red flag. It says these countries may be hiding something. What are they hiding? So it puts attention onto those countries even when those countries won't let you go in to see what they're doing. There are increasingly different ways of monitoring and sampling the environment and testing, testing for vibrations in the earth, testing for radiological materials in the atmosphere, etc. So when countries say we're not going to let you in, we're not going to sign this additional protocol, it's a red flag around those countries as having potential ambitions. Some of them may have simply concerns over sovereignty and intrusiveness, but nonetheless, it tells you you need to look at those countries more carefully.
Many skeptics would say that the problem of covert, dedicated programs still has not been fully or satisfactorily addressed. This is in some ways an intractable problem because you never know what you don't know. It's not entirely the case that the IAEA should be regarded as the full solution to the problem of dedicated covert weapons programs because the IAEA has a limited legal mandate, that is to inspect declared facilities, and it has limited realm or limited portfolio of instruments it can apply. It is not an intelligence agency. It does not have intelligence capacities. It doesn't have satellite reconnaissance. It doesn't have eavesdropping technologies. It does inspections, right? So it really requires some sort of collaboration between the IAEA and key member states to flush out the repertoire of information available to the IAEA. The goal, I think, over the long run is to sort of maximize the levels of transparency that can be achieved. The additional protocol goes a long way in that direction, but there are, at the technical level, a lot of additional steps that could be taken.
North Korea is the only country that's actually withdrawn from the NPT. It had been a member, and it announced that it was withdrawing in 2003. It's not clear that the IAEA was the body that discovered that North Korea was in non-compliance. There was a controversial American intelligence report in 2002 that suggested that North Korea, in fact, had a hidden secret nuclear weapons program, even though there were IAEA monitors in North Korea.
One of the problems is that in 1993, during the first crisis, North Korea was promised light water reactors that it could use to produce nuclear energy. These were never delivered as a function of a variety of political disagreements amongst the Japanese, South Koreans, and the United States. And so from the North Korean perspective, it could reasonably argue that it was entitled to pursue nuclear energy at the Yongbyon reactor. The problem, of course, of the Yongbyon reactor, which is not a light water reactor, it's a heavy water reactor. It produces plutonium as a side product of operating the reactor. And plutonium, of course, is one of the two ways you can make a nuclear weapon.
This was just after the Iraq case, so when agency was fairly vigilant in proving that it can use the new tools to its benefit. And we used first time extensively information analysis, third-party information and environmental samples to look the case, and fairly soon it became obvious that North Korea may have not declared all the nuclear material which it had at its disposal. And then after this disputes, agency also decided to invoke the instrument which it has used very seldom, which is a special inspection.
It does seem certain now that North Korea did manage somehow to hide at least one important nuclear facility, not only from the IAEA, but from American intelligence, as far as we can tell. So the North Koreans, it seems, were cheating for a long time. But in a sense, it doesn't matter too much whether it was, say, the CIA or the IAEA that discovered that North Korea was in non-compliance, because there's routine communication between all of the intelligence communities of countries that have an interest in non-proliferation and the IAEA. There's a fair amount of information sharing. And by the time North Korea realized that the cat was out of the bag, they decided that they were better off actually withdrawing from the NPT and kicking out all of the IAEA monitors, and that's of course precisely what they did in 2003.
The first detonation was in October 2006, and that came about of a failure of the six-party talks to really to work out the first provocation, if you like, of the new millennium, which was the 2003 withdrawal from the NPT. In September 2005, the six-party talks actually arrived at an agreement in which North Korea would take apart its program, let the IAEA back in to inspect, and in exchange it would be given security reassurances from the United States, energy aid, foreign aid, and so forth. In December of 2005, the State Department sanctioned a bank in Macau for laundering North Korean money. And that obviously was seen to be was unwelcome by the Kim Jong-il regime, and that led to the deterioration of that agreement, and in my view led North Korea to increase the tension, to ratchet up the tensions a bit by first testing a missile in I think it's July 2006, and then testing a nuclear device in October 2006. What's important, I think, is that both that missile test and that nuclear test failed. In 2010, a scientist was visiting North Korea, and they revealed to him a very advanced uranium program. So in 2008, North Korea, as a consequence of the negotiations that followed the 2006 test, agreed to take apart its plutonium program, and it did. The IAEA was welcomed back in the country, and they watched as North Korea started to take apart the program. That involved imploding the Yongbyon cooling tower at the Yongbyon reactor. What that means is that although they're not producing plutonium anymore, they still have enough plutonium, we think, for 5 to 10 plutonium-based bombs. And now, of course, in 2010, they reveal a very advanced uranium program. Uranium programs are much easier to hide because you don't need a nuclear reactor to do them, right? You enrich uranium by bombarding it with uranium hexafluoride, and that can be done. That can be accomplished underground, and it can be accomplished at a variety of sites underground. The uranium program is not dissimilar to that. And so there's no doubt that North Korea wants to continue to pursue nuclear weapons. There is concern that it is going to test a weapon soon, and it will be interesting to see what kind of weapon it is they test. Do they test another plutonium bomb to try to get it to work this time, or do they test a uranium bomb? And that will be an interesting phenomenon to watch. So the program is very much active. It is clear, at least to me, that the Kim Jong-un as president will continue to pursue nuclear weapons at the same time as engaging in the same kind of game his father did, going farther down the road, but backing off occasionally in exchange for aid, food, and diplomatic assurances.
One of the advantages of the IAEA is that it's not a state. It's an international body, and its members and its technicians come from all different countries.
It would look like pretty much as what it looks like in Iran, which means that the IAEA has to establish the historical production of nuclear material in the enrichment program, the history of the program from R&D until today, see also North Korea's possible proliferation activities in order to make a full picture to see whether all nuclear material has been declared and all facilities in North Korea are under IAEA safeguards.
So if North Korea can be persuaded once again to come completely clean and to allow, probably for the first time, genuinely thorough inspection and monitoring of its nuclear facilities, the IAEA would be the go-to organization, and they certainly have all of the expertise to do that.
A.Q. Khan was a brilliant engineer, metallurgical engineer, who trained in Europe, in Germany and Belgium. And he was highly regarded by his thesis supervisor and highly recommended. So he got a job with Urenco, which is the British, Dutch, and I think one other country consortium for working on centrifuges and enriched uranium technology. So he was working there initially as a translator, but he gained the respect, the trust of the people there, and he was given bigger responsibilities.
he gained access to the drawings of the centrifuges of the Urenco, which was a leading organization in that field. And he also got access to the list of suppliers for Urenco, the European suppliers, the Swiss, the Italians, the Germans, and all this. So he was a nationalist, a Pakistani nationalist, and in 1972, Bhutto had declared that Pakistan should also have an Islamic bomb, and he asked Munir Ahmed Khan, who was the head of the Pakistani Atomic Energy Commission, an ex-IAEA man. The IAEA connection is there in the sideline, to develop a plutonium bomb. But after the Indian test 1974, A.Q. Khan, now it's unclear here whether he approached the Pakistani government or whether the Pakistani government approached him. The long and short is he was asked by the Pakistan government to undertake work on enriched uranium.
Well, the A.Q. Khan network was really a remarkable breakdown of the non-proliferation system. What you had was a really global network operating from more than a dozen countries over the course of more than 2 decades that started off as an import network supplying Pakistan's nuclear program, but then got turned around into an export network that was supplying countries all over the world. So they were supplying centrifuge technology, which countries can use to enrich uranium to the level required for nuclear weapons. It's really the technology of choice for the determined nuclear cheater because it's small and easy to hide. And they were exporting that to North Korea, to Iran, to Libya, at least. There's almost certainly a 4th customer. They talked in their internal communications about the 4th customer. We haven't yet identified exactly who the 4th customer was. They also attempted to export to Iraq when it was still ruled by Saddam Hussein. Fortunately, the first Gulf War in 1991 cut short Iraq's nuclear weapons program before Iraq had the opportunity to take the advantage of the offer from the Khan network. But they were also exporting actual nuclear weapon designs, at least to Libya, and we strongly suspect to other countries as well. They provided, for example, to Iran a package of information about how to take uranium metal and cast it into the kind of spheres you would want for the core of a nuclear bomb.
So the chain went from North Korea through China to Pakistan and to Iran and Libya, with suppliers in Switzerland, Germany, Italy, and other places. Some subcontract work being done in Malaysia or Southeast Asian countries. And it was a very successful operation. I mean, A.Q. Khan claimed, or the Pakistani military government claimed that this was a rogue operation, but I don't believe that. Because the aircraft which would be used to fly, to ferret the supplies from North Korea and elsewhere, were Pakistan government aircraft.
What was new in a way about the A.Q. Khan network was this sort of global network of private entrepreneurs integrated by a participant in a state network, namely A.Q. Khan, that was sort of reaching out to potential proliferants and saying, look what we have to offer, rather than a state putting together a procurement network saying this is what we need and going out and figuring out ways to get it.
This story had started in '79, and the agencies in the US government had interfered with the arrest of A.Q. Khan and had tolerated, not accepted, but tolerated the weapons development by Pakistan's military government in the 80s because of other considerations on the American side. So I was not surprised at all. I mean, I was surprised at when the revelations came out, New York Times and others, and there's a lot of material on this, that about the extensive scale
of the network?
Well, I think what the CON network revealed that was very distressing was first that there were sources of this technology who could be corrupted to sell it to practically anyone, not just in Pakistan, but in Switzerland and Germany and South Africa and the United States and a variety of countries all over the world, really, where participants were participating in this. Secondly, it revealed that export controls were nowhere near as strong as they needed to be. A lot of this activity was either not noticed or it was actually legal in the countries where it was taking place because their laws were so weak. Thirdly, I think it indicated that our intelligence capabilities, and in particular our cooperation in intelligence between different countries, was nowhere near as strong as it needed to be because it took decades to figure out this network and to take it down ultimately. And I think fourthly, it showed that the world's law enforcement response is nowhere near what it needs to be. Almost all of the participants in the AQCON network are free men today, and they're largely rich free men today. And that's not a good example to send to future potential participants in these kinds of black market networks. I think the IAEA still has a ways to go in its work on nuclear smuggling. What they do now is they receive information provided by member states and put it together into a database, the International Trafficking Database. But what we often don't know from what states are willing to just provide officially, and what you really need to find out through real investigation, going and interviewing people, talking to different police and intelligence people, etc., is where did this material come from? How did it get stolen? We need to move toward a world, and states don't really want to give that information, especially if they're the state that it came from, because they think it's embarrassing. But we need to move to a world where there is more opprobrium for keeping information about that other countries could learn from the IAEA than there is for admitting that you had a problem in nuclear security in the past. Because if we don't identify how these kinds of thefts occur, then we can't learn lessons to prevent them from happening in the future. In the world of nuclear safety, we have much more in-depth lessons learned, root cause analysis, and so on for each incident, and then distribution of that as lessons learned to other facilities. None of that exists really for nuclear security and for nuclear theft and smuggling.
In 2002, there was a public revelation that Iran had begun to construct some nuclear facilities that it had not yet declared to the IAEA. And in the course of the intervening couple of years, it transpired that a long pattern of at least a decade and a half standing of failing to report activities and transactions and developments in their nuclear program that under their safeguards agreement they were obliged to report. They failed to do so. And so this represented a series of unambiguous safeguards violations. In late 2003, Iran adopted a policy of more and fuller cooperation with the IAEA and largely admitted many of these transgressions that fell overwhelmingly into the area of reportage. That is to say, it wasn't what Iran was doing that was the problem, because it was building an enrichment plant or building a uranium conversion facility. These are permitted activities under the NPT, but you're obliged to report them, and they had not done so.
In 2003, when these installations in Natanz enrichment program and clandestine programs which Iran had been running 20 years became public, the IAEA started to look and verify Iran's declaration. In the beginning we didn't use the word non-compliance, but said more that Iran was not meeting its reporting obligations, and the reason for that was the agreement between EU3 and Iran that non-compliance would have deferred this directly to UN Security Council. And then the verification scheme was started and it runs still today.
The IAEA then was faced with the challenge of reconstructing Iran's nuclear history to the point where it was satisfied that it could account for all previously unreported activities and thereby come to the conclusion that there were no undeclared nuclear activities in Iran that might be weapons related. And by 2005, the IAEA judged that Iran's cooperation had not been sufficient to allow adequate reconstruction of that history. Therefore, unanswered questions lingered. The IAEA judged itself to be unable to declare Iran restored to good standing in the regime. And in the face of what appeared to be protracted Iranian failure to cooperate to the extent that the IAEA thought was necessary, they referred the case to the UN Security Council.
The IAEA announced non-compliance about Iran in 2005, just immediately after Iran restarted the enrichment activities. Therefore, non-compliance was just a tool to prevent Iran, to deprive Iran from its legitimate rights for enrichment. And in November 2004, when Iran decided to suspend the enrichment in the framework of Paris Agreement, which was more broader suspension, immediately a week later, the IAEA removed Iran's file from the agenda of Board of Governors, normalized the file. You see, when Iran decided to suspend, everything was fine, no non-compliance, no problem. Iran removed from the agenda. The day Iran started the enrichment, immediately it was decided non-compliance. Immediately they referred to the United Nations Security Council. This is completely political issue.
If you look at the charter of the IAEA and focus on its mandate, it has very limited role in enforcement. It essentially has no enforcement capacity or legal mandate to enforce. When it suspects or finds an instance of non-compliance, its option is to refer the case to the UN Security Council, which then becomes the enforcing body. That, of course, then puts the compliance issue into the realm of international politics.
I mean, they considered Iran as a threat, the Iranian nuclear program as a threat to international peace and security, while Iran has no nuclear bomb. And IAEA for 9 years is reiterating that there is no evidence on even diversion toward nuclear bomb. And this is the implication of the IAEA referral to United Nations Security Council.
The IAEA conducts regular inspections of declared Iranian nuclear facilities. It has more regular contact and interaction with Iran than anybody else. I think it has found some mix of cooperation and considerable frustration in its engagement with Iran.
In 2004-2005, two countries like Egypt and South Korea, the IAEA found them like Iran, non-compliance, the same. But the case was immediately managed, finished, quiet in the IAEA because Egypt and South Korea, they had good relation with the US. And they referred Iranian case to United Nations Security Council in Chapter 7, implementing sanctions, pressures, considering as a threat to international peace and security because of the hostilities between Iran and the US.
The agency has very limited possibilities here. It's mainly the actions of the international community, UN Security Council, which can put pressure on Iran with various means, negotiations, sanctions, embargoes, etc., to bring them to the negotiating table and solve the issues.
In general, I think the feeling is that both the Iran case and the North Korea case call into question the efficacy or adequacy of the world's ability to respond effectively to compliance crises. You might say that the Iran case is still open in the sense that the latest wave of sanctions seems to be more biting, and the pain inflicted on Iran seems to be greater, and Iran's reactions might be more forthcoming as a result, but we still haven't seen the results of that latest wave of efforts to bring them to heel.
I don't think the IAEA is a judge on questions of culpability. The international community should do that. My own view is that it is time to clear that record, and perhaps to do it under the basis of a kind of process that was followed in South Africa under the truth commissions there. That is a no-fault finding, but an effort to try to get at the full truth, that being more valuable in the other questions. The other kinds of issues that the IAEA should involve themselves in the Iranian program is to ensure that it is doing everything that can adequately and usefully be done for the future, so that as the Iranian program progresses in its own directions, the IAEA continues to satisfy itself that it's applying the best technologies, the best techniques, and the best set of arrangements.
If there's going to be a negotiated resolution of this crisis, it has to be a deal between Iran and some outside parties that probably must include Washington, probably must include the so-called P5+1. And the IAEA may well figure in the implementation of any deal, because part of what the outside world will be looking for from Iran is additional transparency, a larger and more intrusive role for the IAEA in confirming the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program. But it will be an implementer more than an actor in. Israel's nuclear posture is inextricably bound up with the wider conflict that it has with its neighbors, both the Palestinians and the wider Arab community. Israel feels surrounded, threatened. It's a powerful, successful state in many ways, but that doesn't prevent it from believing that it faces severe security threats and that its neighbors have never really made full peace with its existence.
In 1981, Israel bombed a reactor in Iraq. This was a facility that was declared and under IAEA safeguards, and Israel believed that it would be used for plutonium production for a possible Iraqi nuclear weapon, and they bombed the facility. This evoked a lot of condemnation from really the entire international community, including the United States.
Other members of the IAEA, and in particular the other Arab and Middle Eastern states, were unhappy with Israel taking military action against Iraq, and argued that by doing so they had violated their place as a member of the IAEA and should no longer be allowed to participate in IAEA activities. The United States supported both Israel generally and Israel's actions in particular, and so said that they would no longer fund the IAEA unless Israel was readmitted. As with many international organizations, the bulk of the IAEA's budget comes from the United States, and so by withdrawing financial support, they would largely have crippled the organization.
The Israeli attack on the Iraqi or Syriac was open, public. The destruction of the Syrian facility, there was a lot of ambiguity in terms of what was there. and the destruction itself, what was accomplished. So from outside it looks like it was nipped in the bud.
The IAEA says that it's very likely that Syria had a reactor and that Israel bombed it. The intelligence that was provided by the United States in the spring after the 2007 attack seemed pretty convincing to me. They had what appeared to be a reactor that was very similar to the gas-cooled graphite-moderated reactor in North Korea. And, you know, they have photographs showing North Koreans in Syria apparently helping with the construction of this facility. So it seems to me very likely that Syria had a reactor under construction that the Israelis bombed.
The Israelis have never actually admitted that they did attack the Syrian facility in 2007, although everybody else assumes that they did. The Syrians have denied that they ever had a nuclear facility there, but as recently as last autumn, the IAEA appears to have confirmed that from all of their information, it was in fact a nuclear reactor, although they don't go as far as to suggest that it was involved in a nuclear weapons program, just that it does appear to have been a nuclear reactor under construction that hadn't been adequately declared by the Syrians.
Well, Israel is a state that is one of the non-members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's a state that is believed to have nuclear weapons, with India and Pakistan and now North Korea, one of the four nuclear-armed non-members of the treaty. It is a member of the IAEA, and its non-weapons facilities are under IAEA safeguards longer. So this is a long-standing issue for the IAEA, and the question of Israel's nuclear weapons and nuclear status come up frequently at IAEA meetings, at the meetings of the General Conference, and will continue to, I think, until there is some serious discussion of arms control in the Middle East.
The United States had rather changed the rules of the game in the last decade in terms of the use of preemptive force to oppose weapons of mass destruction. They were at the time, and still are, in Iraq, at least putatively, because the Iraqi government was building nuclear weapons, and so it would be kind of hard for the United States and the coalition of the willing that was in Iraq to complain about Israel taking preemptive action about somebody else building nuclear weapons.
There are 22 members of the Arab League, and in their view, Israel remains surprisingly exempt from scrutiny or criticism for its own nuclear activities. It has to be said that Israel didn't join the NPT, is violating no freely undertaken obligations, does not have declared civilian nuclear facilities that are under IAEA safeguards, so there's no issue of Israel denying inspections. There are no facilities to inspect. The nuclear facilities that it does possess are linked to its nuclear weapons program and are outside the purview of the IAEA. So it really has to do with the dissatisfaction of Israel's Arab neighbors and the wider non-aligned community that often supports the Arab League in this, the sense that Israel ought to be held more to account for its nuclear behavior, and that it's really not fair that states that are members in good standing of the NPT, the Egypts and Jordans of the world, are being asked to undertake ever more intrusive burdens on behalf of the NPT regime when Israel has nuclear weapons and in fact gets no scrutiny and very little criticism from the Western world.
The Israeli position is that they will join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapons state after there's peace in the Middle East and disarmament of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And whether or not there will be serious discussions of arms control and disarmament among Middle Eastern states remains to be seen, but this possible conference in 2012 or shortly thereafter is one opportunity to begin that discussion. I think it's unlikely that Israel will join the NPT anytime soon, but stranger things have happened.
The NPT encourages the idea of nuclear weapons-free zones. It certainly allows states in various geographic regions of the world to create nuclear weapons-free zones. And there's been talk of one in the Middle East for a long time. Some hope that the countries in the region would agree to denuclearize because it's a zone of conflict.
The Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone was initially proposed, at least at the state level, as part of the process of NPT 95, that is, the Review and Extension Conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1995, when the treaty was made permanent. At that time, the states that wanted it to be made permanent, including the United States and most of its allies, were willing to make a series of commitments to try and induce the other members of the regime to support it. One of them was support for a nuclear weapons-free zone.
All of the states in the region have, in one way or another, supported this idea. It's an idea that's been around for a very long time, and it's an idea that everyone seems to think is pie in the sky, impossible to achieve, and many would say is a bad idea to try. So that's a sort of interesting paradox. The permanent extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was sort of agreed to in 1995 with the provision that there would be progress toward a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. And there had been no progress until 2010. But in 2010, the NPT Review Conference proposed that that the Secretary General of the United Nations appoint a facilitator who would conduct discussions with all of the parties in the region and convene a conference in 2012.
Late in 2011, the Finns announced that they would try to facilitate that conference. So far, it hasn't been scheduled, and it's uncertain whether or not Israel would agree to participate in the conference, and it's unlikely that the other Middle Eastern states would agree to a nuclear weapons-free zone that didn't include Israel.
I think Israel will remain wedded to what they see as the ultimate insurance policy, which is possession of nuclear weapons. And in any environment outside of very substantial settlement of the existing conflict, it seems to me unlikely that Israel will significantly modify its nuclear policy. You know, in the 1990s, this became an issue, and there was an arms control process between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors, and eventually they foundered on exactly on the proposition that the Arabs wanted to discuss Israel's nuclear capabilities, and Israel refused to do so except at the end of a process. They felt, you know, until peace has been achieved, that insurance policy is something that they will prefer to retain. So I don't see any prospect of change in that situation in the near to medium term, and the prospects for Israeli accession to the NPT are linked, in fact, to this very intractable, deeper conflict which people have been trying for several decades for multiple decades really, to resolve without much success.
The Fukushima plant is an old nuclear reactor. It was scheduled to be decommissioned shortly before the earthquake and tsunami of March 11th, 2011. But it was extended because of the need to maintain generation capacity and the delays in bringing new capacity online. The plant was never designed to withstand an earthquake of a magnitude 9 when it was originally constructed. But it did actually withstand the earthquake remarkably well. It was the tsunami that did all of the relevant damage at the nuclear plant itself.
The earthquake that led to the disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant occurred at 2:44 p.m. on March 11th. At the time, Units 1, 2, and 3 of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant were in operation, whereas Unit 4, 5, and 6 were under a regular checkup. Following the earthquake, Unit 1 through 6 lost outside electricity, but the nuclear reactors stopped automatically, and all of the plant recovered electricity through the function of diesel generators for the moment. However, the first wave of tsunami, estimated to be around 4 meters, had hit Fukushima Daiichi at 3:27. And second wave of even bigger tsunami, which is estimated to have been over 10 meters, had hit the plant 8 minutes later. These tsunamis has not only struck down emergency seawater pumps, but also flooded the plant and its equipments. Among the equipments that were destroyed were the emergency diesel generators, most of which were placed under the ground level. Sometimes between these tsunamis, the first one and the second bigger one, Units 1 through 5 lost all of its electricity. Following these sequence of events, TEPCO had announced that Article 10 event had occurred at 3:42, and Article 15 event had occurred at 4:45, which is basically a declaration of emergency at the nuclear power plant.
That's the second worst civilian nuclear power accident in history, caused entirely by the tsunami and completely preventable if the backup power generators had been on high ground.
The biggest reason certainly was this gigantic tsunami which came and which was much higher than they thought, and therefore the backup power for the reactor was not designed for that. So this is the main reason. But they were, I think, also taken a little bit off guard, so some of the actions could have been becoming earlier, perhaps to mitigate some of the consequences. But this is what took place. Also, I think the administrative arrangements were not up to the level they should be. There were problems with the communications people.
The common wisdom is that the Japanese government did not respond well to this nuclear accident. But I should clarify that the central national government of Japan was not the only body responsible for responding to a major nuclear accident. There were a series of levels of government, including prefectural and local governments, that also have roles to play in the event of a major natural disaster. And in this particular case, the reactor was owned and operated by a private utility, TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power and Light Company. And none of those levels of government, nor TEPCO, the utility generator, responded terribly effectively. The international community as a whole very quickly decided that it was skeptical of the Japanese government's claims about the severity of the accident, and the single biggest contribution the international community made was to keep the Japanese authorities' feet to the fire and to try to keep them honest about the actual severity of the accident. It wasn't that the Japanese government was trying to be dishonest deliberately, but it was very self-consciously trying not to induce panic, and so it gave more conservative estimates of the severity of the accident than in retrospect people said would probably have been warranted at the time.
The only good thing actually what I can say is that in my view they did the evacuation of the local people fairly early, so that reduced some of the consequences. And then communications to the outside world, they were very modest, and international community didn't have for a long time a really good understanding what was taking place.
As a result of Fukushima, the Japanese people have turned really quite dramatically, decisively against nuclear power generation, and polls now show that the Japanese would like to be out of the nuclear business altogether. Similar reaction also in Germany, where Fukushima prompted a 180-degree turn in Chancellor Angela Merkel's policy. She was going to increase Germany's reliance on nuclear energy, and in the immediate aftermath of the crisis declared that Germany would abandon nuclear power generation altogether. In my view, these reactions are actually all short-term, and that in 3, 4, 5 years we will start seeing fairly clear recovery in the prospects of the nuclear power generation business, in part because if you step back and look at it objectively, nuclear generation is actually remarkably safe compared to almost every other alternative. The long-term effect of Fukushima is that the countries that do nuclear power generation on a large scale will be paying more attention to exactly where they situate plants, what kinds of contingencies they plan for in terms of natural and other disasters, what kinds of backup systems they make sure are in place. The older design generators are probably going to be brought offline on schedule or perhaps even early because they will be found not to be up to spec in these respects. The new power generation plants are much better designs, a lot better safety systems designed into them. In Japan particularly, some of the reactors that have been located very unfortunately in geologically unstable zones, for example, one important nuclear plant generates power in Shizuoka Prefecture. The plant itself sits at the intersection of 3 tectonic plates and is built on landfill. Just about the worst place you could possibly think of to put a nuclear plant. I'd be very surprised if that plant were ever brought back online. But other plants in Japan are actually in much more stable, safer geological areas and much better equipped for dealing with disasters. Those will be the blueprints for nuclear power generation moving down the road.